Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this special session of the Leuven seminar, which we organized together with the Hegel Society of Great Britain and in particular with Stephen Houlgate. We're here today to pay tribute to Bob Stern's life and work. I think I can speak for all of us by expressing my gratitude for Bob's contributions to Hegel scholarship, but mostly for his generosity, his kindness, his capacity to stimulate debates and inspire his friends, his colleagues, and his students. So before I say a few words about the structure of today's session, I'd like to ask the participants to switch on your camera if possible, so that we can see each other. It's no obligation, but it could be good for all of us if we can see many faces. I also wanted to mention that, as is usual with the Leuven seminar, we keep open the Zoom meeting after the recording. So if you want to stay on and have more informal conversations after we concluded the formal part, everyone is welcome to do so. So as regards the structure of today's session, we will have 5 presentations by 5 speakers who knew Bob well: Stephen Houlgate, Ulrich Schlösser, Leonard Weiss, Alison and Forstenzer. All speakers have for about 15 minutes to present their ideas. And after the first 2 speakers, we'll do a Q&A session of about 15 minutes. But I think that given the special nature of this session, you can ask questions, but it's also perfectly fine to simply share some of your thoughts on what Bob meant for you. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be a formal Q&A session in all regards. So after the Q&A, we take a short break of about 5 minutes, and then we'll resume with 3 more contributions, and again a Q&A session of about 15 minutes. So let me now introduce the first speaker, Stephen Houlgate. Stephen Houlgate is a professor at the University of Warwick and a specialist of Hegel and German idealism more generally, with, as many of you will know, a focus on Hegel's Science of Logic. I'd like to mention the title of his most recent monograph on Hegel, which is Hegel on Being, and it's a 2-volume project published in 2022 with Bloomsbury. I'll keep it short and give the floor to Stephen. And let me just mention the title of his presentation, which is Bob Stern on Willkür and Freedom in Hegel.
Good. Thank you very much, Karin, and thanks especially to you for initiating this event and with your colleagues for doing most of the organizing. So I really appreciate that. I should say to those of you who have joined us that we had a very successful meeting of the Hegel Society of Great Britain in September on Bob's work. But it is really good now to have an online event that I think enables people from far and wide to participate. So I'm particularly grateful for Karin initiating this idea, and also thankful to you for joining. Bob Stern and I were friends for 40 years, having met as graduate students around 1984. From then on, we were close allies philosophically, working closely together for the Hegel Society of Great Britain, and sharing many views about Hegel, Kant, and the world more generally. We agreed, for example, that Hegel is a conceptual realist, and that his philosophical method involves an important moment of passivity, of letting thought unfold itself. We also agreed that for Hegel, ethical life, especially a life lived in love, is one that fulfills the law, but in which the obligation and constraint of the law fall away. And we agreed that in these 2 last respects, Hegel comes close to Martin Luther. Unsurprisingly, however, we disagreed on some issues too. I've always been interested in the transitions in Hegel's system from one concept to another, but Bob showed little interest in them and didn't appear to think they work. Furthermore, I believe there are 2 routes into Hegel's logic, one through the phenomenology and one through the resolve, the Entschluss, to think purely. Bob, however, was persuaded by Peirce's distinction between real and artificial doubt and thought that only the former could take us through phenomenology into speculative logic. In this talk, however, I will revisit a different disagreement between us concerning Hegelian freedom and the place in it of Willkür. As I understand it, Willkür in Hegel's philosophy of right begins, like the resolve to think purely, with an act of absolute abstraction. Unlike that resolve, however, Willkür then combines this free reflection which abstracts from everything with dependence on a given content. This content of Willkür, what it wills, comprises our needs and desires as well as their objects and is not under our control. Yet Willkür regards itself as detached from such desires and objects, and so is free to choose between them. It can choose only what's given to it by nature or perhaps by society. But as far as it is concerned, nothing constrains its choice. As Willkür, Hegel states, I quote, I have the possibility of determining myself in this or that direction. I'm able to choose, end of quote. Such Willkür, for my Hegel, is a real form of freedom. It's not an illusion, because our thought has the real capacity to detach itself from our desires and freely affirm this one or that one as it sees fit. Yet, as Bob Stern argues in an important essay on Hegel and Luther, Hegel does not regard Willkür as true practical freedom. True freedom, Stern explains, consists in willing what is rational, and this leaves no room for free choice. Hegel certainly allows a limited place for Willkür when reason leaves our options open, as, for example, in our choice of fashion, yet choice does not belong to being truly free, rational, and ethical itself. In Stern's words, I quote, to be free in a positive way is not to be exercising free choice at all, but following the necessity of reason where it leads. Bob Stern is right about this. True freedom, or willing what is rational, requires assent to what reason requires, yet it does not simply rest on personal choice, because, as Stern explains, the content of such freedom is determined by reason, and this leaves the subject, I quote Stern, with no choice or decision about what to do. Furthermore, though Stern doesn't quite put it this way, the form of free ethical action is that of acting out of love and lawfulness that have become second nature, acting from an ethical disposition. So in this respect too, true freedom does not consist in exercising choice. It doesn't lie in choosing to love your neighbor or choosing to respect the law. This is not to deny that free ethical agents can pull back from what reason demands and thereby act irrationally. We can always break the habit of ethical action and choose to act otherwise. In so doing, however, Stern argues, I quote, one is only ever opting for the bad and not the good. Since this is the case, one is not really exercising a choice at all, a view Stern thinks is shared by Hegel and Luther. Yet how can opting for the bad not really involve exercising choice? Stern's point, I think, is this. One cannot be truly free and ethical, truly good in exercising choice, because true freedom means acting from an ethical disposition. So insofar as we withdraw from this disposition into choice, we necessarily withdraw from being ethical and doing what is good. In exercising choice in this case, therefore, we've already chosen to do what's bad. So we do not face a real choice between doing what is bad and doing what is good. Another way to put Stern's point is as follows. We cannot choose to be ethical because in exercising choice at all, we stop being ethical and revert to being moral or asserting our abstract right. We may no longer wish to act ethically out of habit, but prefer to act ethically out of choice, out of personal responsibility. In this case, however, we don't face a real choice between acting ethically or not, and we deceive ourselves if we think we do. For in choosing choice, as it were, we've already chosen to be moral rather than ethical, to give primacy to our own judgment and conviction rather than to reason and the good. In this sense, we cannot choose to be ethical. Now, this point that Bob Stern makes very powerfully strikes me as largely correct, though I would add one qualification that I think Stern doesn't consider. We cannot choose to be ethical while continuing to prioritize choice, while continuing to be primarily moral. For to be truly free is not to exercise choice, but to follow, I quote Stern, the necessity of reason where it leads. Yet, in another sense, I can choose to be ethical. Namely, if I choose to give up my moral stance, and with it to give up the primacy of my own choice and judgment. Such a choice is made by the hard-hearted judge in Hegel's phenomenology, who, in forgiving the hypocritical agent, relinquishes himself and his unrelenting judgment. A similar choice is made by the hypocrite, who confesses his hypocrisy to the judge and so gives up the conviction that he alone may determine the character of his action. These acts of forgiveness and confession, Hegel argues, follow from the fact that each consciousness recognizes the other to be the same as itself. The agent, for example, sees that the hard-hearted judge is just as hypocritical as he is, and, I quote Hegel, intuiting this equality and giving voice to it, he, the agent, confesses this to the other. In giving up their individual moral self-righteousness, therefore, the two moral consciences together form a bond of reciprocal recognition, which is absolute spirit. Forgiveness and confession are thus not unmotivated arbitrary acts, since they rest on and express recognition of the equality between two selves. Nonetheless, they are acts of freedom. Indeed, they're acts of free abstraction, for letting go of one's own distinct particularity is precisely abstracting oneself from the latter. Moreover, these acts of abstraction leave each self conscious, above all, of its universality. As Hegel says of the hypocritical subject, quote, it casts its actuality aside, makes itself into a sublated this, and as a result exhibits itself, in fact, as universal. The act of letting go of or abstracting from one's moral particularity thus recalls the initial act of absolute abstraction in the philosophy of right, through which the will first establishes its freedom as pure universality. This latter act is the principal component of the first form of freedom, namely Willkür, or the freedom to choose. Similarly, I would argue, the act of letting go in forgiveness and confession can also be regarded as eine Willkür, as the moral choice to abstract from one's own self-righteous particularity and no longer to be simply moral. Of course, the Willkür exercised in unconstrained choice is different from that exercised in forgiveness. Such choice is my freedom to determine myself in this or that direction, and so grounds what will eventually be the moral freedom of personal self-determination. By contrast, forgiveness rests on recognizing one's equality with another self, and so grounds an ethical, indeed religious bond of mutual recognition between the two selves. Yet both involve the freedom to abstract from one's particularity and a consciousness of not being bound to the latter. In that sense, both forgiveness and unconstrained choice, as Hegel conceives them, are acts of Willkür that constitute the beginning, though only the beginning, of more developed forms of freedom. The same can be said for the resolve to think purely that initiates the science of logic. For Hegel, both the freedom of pure thought in his logic and the freedom of genuine mutual recognition in his phenomenology begin with the free act of letting go of, and thereby abstracting from, particularity, from particular assumptions about thought and being in one case, and from the particularity of moral conscience in the other. Both freedom of thought and ethico-religious freedom thus begin with an act of Willkür, with the choice to become truly free and rational, and so to give up the primacy of choice. In the philosophy of right, too, practical freedom begins with Willkür, or free choice, though of course the latter does not immediately choose to give up choice. In Stern's view, however, the fact that Hegel begins with Willkür is not what is most important. Most important is Hegel's rich account of freedom in its concrete ethical form. Furthermore, for Stern, Hegel does not derive concrete freedom from Willkür, nor is the latter a moment within concrete freedom as such. Indeed, Stern suggests Willkür is not even a form of abstract freedom. It's not freedom at all, but is governed by desire. Though at one point he appears to concede that it is a limited model of freedom. In my view, by contrast, Willkür for Hegel is unequivocally abstract freedom. Moreover, we can't understand true concrete freedom properly unless we derive it from its abstract beginning, from Willkür. This derivation in turn shows us two things. First, that we are not truly free and ethical in exercising Willkür itself. But second, that Willkür as abstract freedom nonetheless remains a moment within concrete freedom. Bob Stern accepts the first point, but denies the second as I formulated it. For Stern, true freedom can allow space for the exercise of Willkür, but Willkür is not itself a form of freedom. It is thus not the logical beginning of concrete freedom, nor is it a moment within the latter. This is a subtle difference between Bob Stern and myself that we were not able to resolve. Nonetheless, it provided the occasion for fruitful conversations with him that I treasure and greatly miss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So I think we will move directly to the second talk by Ulrich Schlösser. Ulrich is a professor at the University of Tübingen, and he has published widely on Kant and German idealism. And of his many publications on Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, I'd like to mention a monograph titled Das Erfassen des Einleuchtens, Fichtes Wissenschaftslehre 1804, which was published in 2001. And the title of his contribution is In Memoriam Robert Stern, A Life in Philosophy.
Thank you. So usually we tend to distinguish between the philosopher and the person, but in Bob's case, the philosophical personality made just such a difference for our academic life. We all know that his cheerfulness, his energy, and his positive attitude made philosophy simply a good place for us for a long time, where all of us could somehow flourish. And we all remember his many ideas, his being sharp, crisp, quick, some kind of highly awake, for himself too much awake often. And also his being efficient, think of the EJP. However, his contributions were always in a certain way specifically constructive. So he had no interest in power play. And especially in the history of philosophy and on the continent more than in Britain, we find often this type of ironic attitude where people reconstruct some kind of outrageous position, and then they always imply at the same time that they don't mean it. And Bob's response was always like, well, okay, but aren't there enough things to discuss we actually might consider to really mean? And I always benefited from this attitude. And if I think about his positive spirit, I have to think about another experience I had with him. It's a long time ago. We were at the Berlin Gemäldegalerie, and we were looking at one of these horrible paintings of the hell by Hieronymus Bosch, where you could see all the devils torturing the souls. And Bob looked at it quite puzzled, but in his cheerfulness, he said, well, I don't know. What are those people supposed to have done as to actually deserve that? So he couldn't imagine that. And of course, we all remember his very open and courageous way of dealing with his illness, which kind of thing will all help us in bleak moments of the life. Now, a person who has a lot of positive energy, he has a capacity to explore a territory. And he has a kind of a long trajectory in life, even though life was somehow too short. And here I mix a little bit of geography and philosophy. So I personally, as many of you know, met Bob in Sheffield when we were both working there at a long time ago. And since then, I met him in Berlin, in Toronto, in various places in Britain, in Tübingen, in Sydney, in Beijing, and finally again in Sheffield, where he was so kind to spend much time with me when I couldn't make it to the discussion or the conference on his honor. And just before I go into philosophy, I try to pick out two memories I have from my experience with Bob Stone. One of them, so even Bob did never quite concede that the waves in Australia are much higher than at the Norfolk beaches where he has grown up. And so for Björn Radberg, the Lögstrup scholar, and myself, the waves were like a firm distinction between this, as in Kant's, between the appearances and the things in themselves. But for Bob, swimming meant always to be outside of the breaking wave, so to speak, in the unbound of the Pacific. And at the time, I thought this is so Hegelian, you know, if you, whenever there's a limit, you always have to be beyond that limit. But nowadays, I somehow always think it symbolizes his power to explore the new and also his courage in respect of what's open and what's unbound. And I mentioned another brief memory. So when Bob was in Toronto, there was this unfortunate volcano who blocked the way back home for people who could fly home. And Paul Franks and I enjoyed that, actually having around him a little bit longer. But for him, this was quite an uncomfortable situation. Actually, Hegel too would have disapproved of that such a stupid thing as a volcano, such a spiritless thing of the volcano can stop the development of thought. But for Bob, the link close to home, close to his family or so, was always very important. And in a certain way, I think that holds for philosophy too. So even though he did explore, so to speak, the unbound territories of continental philosophy, he always kept a close link to this kind of British Cambridge style of philosophy, this crisp and clear style. And so let's look a little bit at his philosophical trajectory. So when Bob worked on his first book, so the situation in Britain was such that Kant was already and again a firm presence in the British philosophy. And in his theoretical philosophy, Bob moved on from the Kantian unity of the object in our syntheses to the Hegelian concrete universal. Much later, he sketched a similar development in practical philosophy. So as all of you remember, he contributed to a somehow more realist reading of Kant's ethics, portraying it against the background of the divine command theory, and arguing that merely the obligatoriness of the law is kind of infused with self-legislation. Through Schiller, the criticism of Kant's dualism, he then reached Hegel, where the ethical demands are kind of embedded in social life. Well, maybe too much so. Thus, this path goes on to Kierkegaard, transcending the universal as it is merely embedded in our society. Now, for Bob, this development leads in a loop back to the divine command theory. But I read Kierkegaard rather as transcending any moral obligatoriness, leading to the absolute or possibly nowhere. Thus, from this point, you could go anywhere, and Bob moved on to Leuven and finally to the philosophy of Luther. So he told me that due to his illness, someone else will have to work on the Luther project. But I, as a Prussian Protestant, have to say, without a Jewish intellectual, Bob, I wouldn't want to go there. And from that trajectory, I kind of would like to highlight two themes briefly that stick out. And the first topic I want to highlight are transcendental arguments. They somehow appear untimely in Bob's own oeuvre, since he has been identified as moving on to Hegel, when transcendental arguments, as modern as they look, are basically a Kantian piece of philosophy. And it was striking that at the two conferences in honor of Bob Stern this spring, as far as I remember, no one mentioned this part of his oeuvre. And for this reason, I thought I will or I should. Now, in the language of the geographer or the geographic explorer, you could somehow say that transcendental arguments are somehow like an island. We know it's there, we know its narrow limits, and right now we have just no inclination to go there, like the Isle of Man or Helgoland or something like that. And the limits of these arguments are kind of well known. Take a Kantian example. From the fact that I'm an identical self in all instances of the thought I think, I can only infer my beliefs that the world seems to be well ordered, not that it's actually well ordered. However, Bob's exploring a modest understanding of transcendental arguments, there is more to them than just resignation. He really offers a subtle treatise on philosophical methodology. So what we as philosophers are doing is obviously, on the one hand, neither conceptual analysis, nor is it primarily dependent on our empirical knowledge of ourselves. On the other hand, I don't think that it's promising to delve straightforwardly into metaphysical issues, such as the monism-pluralism debate in the contemporary American East Coast style. That reminds me of pre-Kantian rationalism. Without taking up a self-reflective stance, it's hard to see on what grounds this dispute could be settled at all. Here I remember a kind of discussion on windy metaphysics long time ago in a reading group with Bob and David Bell. Now, transcendental arguments offer a way of how to introduce the self-reflective stance and relate it not primarily to what's straight out there, but to our beliefs and the inner coherence of our worldview. So in a certain way, they're still present. We need them, even if we don't call them as such. In assessing their modesty, we should not overlook that we can't help taking up the subject's point of view. Following Moore and Stroud and others, I cannot claim that necessarily I believe P and P is not the case. I can merely say that still contingently true that the world fulfills my demands, and that's already something, isn't it? Now, the second theme that sticks out from the trajectory, and I would like to take up, is Bob's turn to the philosophy of Knut Løgstrup. In the language of the exploration, I think this is a genuine discovery. Well, of course, as it's the case with the West Indies, some people have already been there. And the question Kantians and Hegelians, especially on the continent, have is the following: why should we settle there? I think that Bob's aim is to genuinely understand what it means to be under an ethical demand, and if one fulfills it, to be a good man, such that the way how we spell it out and explain it does not strongly diverge from the original understanding. Let me offer two caricatures, one of Kant and one of Hegel. Suppose there's a person about to drown in the river. Now the Kantian has to take up or even form a maxim that goes beyond the individual case. Then he has to perform the universalizability test. This can be tricky as it's dependent on the underlying description of the situation. It's based on the respect, and surprisingly not on the respect for the person, but for the moral law. The moral law depends on reason, and finally I realize I can't help understanding myself as a reasonable being. Accordingly, The reasoning goes all the other direction round, and finally I jump into the water. Now the result is the correct one, but the reasoning may not be the most intuitive one. Lögstrup and Bob with him ask, how can we understand the obligation if we keep faith in the basic fact that the other needs help and it's in my power to provide it? Now my second caricature, it's on Hegel. Sorry, apologies for Hegelian presence. The entire setting in Hegel is different. It's more geared towards regular interactions in society, and the key tool is recognition. However, as a reader of the phenomenology of spirit knows, recognition has its dark sides. E.g., in the fight of the duel, I recognize the other as well. The bright side comes fully to the foreground in the idea of reconciliation or even redemption. It's a mutual relationship that includes the acceptance of one's own finitude. Hegel even suggests that it thereby coincides with the mediation of the infinite and the finite, allowing for a presence of the former. I think I realized in a discussion with Bob that the coincidence between the two modes of recognition, infinite, finite, and intersubjective, can never happen, as the first one is always asymmetrical, as substance and mode in Spinoza. This, however, is not the only problem. In Hegel's description, it seems as if the intersubjective reconciliation comes about by the guilty person's understanding that the other, merely judging person is not any better than herself. But what shall we think of the moral quality of limiting one's claims on these grounds alone? So Kant and Hegel seems to be looking at the wrong place. Bob's Lögstrup is focusing on the element of self-transcendence. There's a partly genuine selflessness, which is the hallmark of the moral good and asymmetrical actions. These are just a very few glimpses at Bob's life and his ideas, and I have to say, I don't have adequate words to express my gratitude to have known them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. So the floor is open for questions and maybe other contributions. You can use the raise hand function if you want. Alison, please.
Thanks. So, Stephen, I wanted to ask you about your characterization of the difference between yourself and Bob on this, the choice kind of to relinquish being a chooser and kind of to sort of put oneself instead into the space of reason. So is it fair to say that you think the difference is this, that for Bob, there is a choice to kind of relinquish one's own power of choice and judgment, but having made it, you then have kind of left freedom behind and you've moved into somewhere else. Whereas you're saying, Stephen, that for you, that initial choice still sort of has to be seen as an aspect of what results. So it's kind of incorporated as a kind of transcended element into, so that it's not, you have relinquished the freedom of choice, but that relinquishing still depends upon sort of a little moment of choice. Is that right?
Partly. I guess. I mean, there are quite a few differences embedded in a way in what I was describing. So one of them, I think, is quite stark. That and I've just reread Bob's article this afternoon on Hegel and Luther, which I think is a wonderful essay. And he wants to insist that Willkür is not really any form of freedom at all. It's not free choice, because it's really has given itself over to desire. Now that's part of Hegel's story, in my understanding. That, but I think there's also the other side, which is that we have the sort of, if you like, what Henry Alison calls the sort of incorporation thesis in Kant. We have the free endorsing of that desire as well. So I think that there's a difference in the way we understand Willkür. I think Hegel thinks that's a matter of free choice, and we have that genuine, albeit abstract freedom. Bob thinks it's not really free choice at all. Then, okay, so what Bob, I think, does is distinguish then between assent and choice. So Bob's well aware that we have to assent to the demands of reason, but that's not a matter of Willkür for him. That's not a matter of free choice. Whereas I think it is connected to that. And so we both agree, and this is what, one of the things that brought us together. And I have to say, it was a struggle in a way to find something that we didn't agree on, because we agreed on so much over the years, that philosophy involves this element of letting go of a certain passivity. And that is, well, Bob called it sort of medio-passive, that it involved an element of activity on our part. And so he acknowledges that element of assent, but he doesn't call it Willkür. Willkür is just indulging our desires in choosing, I want to have that coat rather than that coat. And what's interesting is the way he puts it is that in being in a rational, organized society, there are spaces that reason just has nothing to contribute to. Okay, well, then you can exercise your Willkür. But that doesn't integrate Willkür, certainly not as a freedom, but Willkür at all, into that system of freedom. Whereas I think it's not just a matter of leaving a space for Willkür, but that, Hegel's account of civil society understands the exercise of Willkür as being part of ethical freedom. So it's a little bit complicated. There is one other thing, though, and I hinted at it at the very beginning, right when we met, which is back as students in about 1984 or so. One of the things that became apparent is that Bob just isn't interested in the transitions, or wasn't interested in the transitions. But for me, that's what it's all about. So for me, you have to start with Willkür. You have to work through abstract right, morality, and get to ethical life. But Bob didn't think that was right. So it's interesting that in much of the work that he did, if you think of the first book on the object, I mean, he goes straight to the Begriff. He goes straight to concepts. Whereas I think, no, you've got to work your way through being an essence first to get there. And I think this is where one of the things where we differ is, can we think of Willkür as the logical beginnings of freedom, from which we then derive freedom? And I think Bob's answer was no. In fact, I looked back over because I gave this paper at the EJP conference or part of it that Joe organized. And I looked back at the discussion, and then Bob's remark to me was, "You've got stuck at stage one. You've got to get on to stage 2 and 3. Sort of get on there." And my feeling is that Bob really wasn't that interested in stage 1. That he wanted to get on. So that was a bit of a difference. I'm not sure if that explains.
It definitely does. I just very quickly to respond. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's one of these things where I don't entirely know whether it's just a terminological difference, but I think there is a substantial difference. And yeah, I think I feel a bit inclined to agree with you that I find it difficult to see assent as not, But anyway, I know others waiting.
But Ulrich has alerted to this. I mean, the great thing about Bob was how generous and energetic and passionate he was in having these conversations. So, obviously, I saw him as a student. We used to spend a lot of time together. We, met as a family, and we would go back on the train after the Hegel conferences, and he just loved arguing about these things. So it was a real delight to discuss this stuff with Bob. There was never any feeling. We never fell out, ever, in 40 years. I can't remember ever falling out with Bob about anything. But we would have very energetic discussions about things. So So
I
yeah,
did
it was.
once encounter him get annoyed with the hotel, but
Oh,
I
did
think things had to be really quite bad for him to get.
Yes. But yeah, anyway, thanks for your question.
Okay, so we move to Joe. Joe, please.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. Just reminded me, Alison, of there was something that would drive him mad, I remember, which was that, like, if you sent him work to look at, but you didn't put page numbers on it. I remember another graduate student saying they showed up once and he was in a bad mood and he dropped the paper without the page numbers. And then they're all on the floor in a mess. And he was like, why don't people put page numbers on? That was the one time I heard he lost it with a graduate student. Yeah, all over page numbers. Yeah, thanks, guys. That was really great to hear. Ulrich, I kind of wanted to ask. I've been thinking a bit about this transcendental argument stuff. I just wanted to share my impression of it with you and see, if you think I've got it right or what I've missed. So basically, I got the sense with that book and those projects that Bob thought that these arguments were going to work, right? He didn't go into the project thinking, in the end, transcendental arguments aren't that interesting. But I got the sense that over time, that's where he kind of settled, right? That in the end, they're not that interesting. Better to do metaphysics. Why on earth concern ourselves with how we must represent things when you can actually get it right, right? You can get to the heart of the structure of the object. Hegel got that. So there was this worry that in the end, transcendental arguments were just too Kantian. One, they're really difficult to, make work anyway. So why not just do the metaphysical thing? And they're both hard, but if you get the metaphysics right, you've hit upon the structure of reality. And I take it that part of his concern was that, if you think, look, actually, we need to kind of stick to transcendental arguments, or there's something kind of easier about them than doing pre-critical metaphysics. Part of his worry was to kind of smuggle in a Cartesian assumption that somehow self-knowledge is easier than knowledge of objects. So he thinks, Descartes goes wrong in that. Kant basically follows Descartes in thinking that somehow it's easier to understand the necessary structures of our mind than it is to understand the necessary structures of reality. But why on earth think that? Just start with trying to understand the world and what reality is fundamentally like. If it turns out to be entirely hopeless, then that gives you reason to, stop. But it's not hopeless, and it's not like going transcendental made anything any easier. We got into all the same troubles, all the same mess, but trying to figure out what the hell was going on with the structure of our own thought. So, yeah, I've thrown a bunch of things there, but like I got the sense that those were some of the reasons why he just thought, in the end, transcendental arguments aren't really the way to go in doing philosophy. Better to just engage in metaphysics. And actually, there's nothing really worrying about pre-critical metaphysics. Kant just didn't like it and was unfair on it. So anyway, a lot there, but yeah, I'd be curious to know what you think.
Well, I mean, I personally wouldn't see Kant as in the Cartesian tradition. We certainly can get wrong about ourselves and the content of our own minds, similar as we can go wrong about the outer side. So in that sense, I don't see Bob's reading as one in this tradition. I mean, yeah, so in that sense, I certainly differ. And I wouldn't say that it necessarily implies that I know myself better, but it does imply talking about the reality or talking about reality, bearing in mind that you are referring to it, or bearing in mind that you are thinking about it. And in that sense, I wouldn't say that. So, if you have this very moderate description in that way, I wouldn't see that Hegel is completely out of the ballpark of this type of reflection. And I still think it differs substantially from positions such as Spinoza, Leibniz, or Jonathan Scheffer. These are all positions which don't do that. So in a certain way, our knowledge has a kind of perspectival element. It has some kind of first personal, third personal balance. And all these aspects do play a certain role about how we talk about metaphysics. So the question is not that we kind of drop out metaphysics and start to be Cartesian first and then get it in later on. The issue is rather not having, so to speak, a metaphysics which does not really take the self-reflective stance and its implications into account in the way of how to talk about metaphysics. So we need both, so to speak, a kind of cognitive semantic stance and a metaphysics stance. And we need to address both of them coming together in the right way. And I miss that in some of the contemporary debates. I also remember that back then this was already a debate between Bob and Eric Olson, who's the kind of person who adheres to the kind of Van Inwagen style metaphysics. And well, I wouldn't go as far as that. I wouldn't go as far as that. And so what I was suggesting is, now, suppose you wouldn't go as far as that, and you have then some kind of self-reflection on what is it that you're doing? And if you have this kind of self-reflection, what is it what you're doing? So I picked up the Transcendental Argument books after the conference you organized in spring. And I thought, well, maybe it's not some anti-skeptical argument or anything, but still is a way to how to develop one's own thoughts or the inner coherence of one's own thoughts. And I agree that that should be a kind of a metaphysic plus setting, but in that respect, it's still kind of worthwhile, despite what I know Bob thought about it. So that's roughly my attitude.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Are there further questions? If not, Ulrich, I'd like to ask you a question inspired by Stephen's contribution. I was wondering if you had any ongoing philosophical disagreements with Bob, or the themes that you return to time and again.
Well, I mean, we had a disagreement in what was the last paper of him I actually read. It was on Schelling's freedom essay. And I did talk about that in the conference in spring. And I was looking for an enemy I had to write about myself. And then Bob sent me his paper and I said, oh, wow, he's the enemy I'm arguing against. And I think one reason is that he kind of adheres to the position, which was a bit like what Stephen kind of described. So is a rationality leads the path, and then there's merely issue of withdrawing. And I tried to, and he thought that that's also Schelling's position, and I kind of disagree. Because for Schelling, so to speak, there is an internal moment of the rationality that is such that it's open for a deviation, so to speak. It has this internal ambivalence of being both what universalizes and what withdraws in itself. And if this other aspect were not there, it could not be motivating at all. And I personally kind of sympathize with that. And so we had a disagreement on how Hegelian we should be in terms of the conception of freedom, motivation, and the evil. And I think he was too much Hegelian, actually. And that may have led him to from here, I just look at the Tübingen Stift. So that made him led to Luther. And I'm very skeptic about that. I think without him, as I said, that looks quite so wrong.
So you only discovered that you had a disagreement at a very late stage.
Yes. Yes,
friendship.
that's true. That's true.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just briefly ask, sorry, Ulrich, you said you're skeptical, what, about the connection between Hegel and Luther? Or I didn't quite understand what it was you were skeptical about.
Oh, I think I'm rather suspicious whether we should go to Luther at all. Hegel would be the maximum I would be willing to go, but I'm not sure how effective I'm there. I spent 8 years in a Protestant boarding school, and so there may be non-philosophical reasons for that.
Okay, I was just going to just note that because we came at this from slightly different routes, Bob and I, but we definitely came together thinking that the Hegel and Luther connection was a very fruitful one. But one of the things I really admired about Bob, and you alerted to the fact, of course, that to his Jewish background, is Bob's extraordinary ability to enter sympathetically into positions that in some ways were very different from where he had come from. And that is quite a gift, actually. And he never lost sight of the arguments that were involved But I mean, I love this article, and I've just been rereading it, and I think, yeah, this is theologians there are theologians who can't write about Luther as well as this. So I think it was a remarkable facility that Bob had to enter into and understand from the inside very sympathetically positions that you might think he would find a little bit more difficult. But he did it extraordinarily well. And so I guess I just like to let that resonate with people. I'm sure he did it in other respects as well, but it seemed to be a real gift he had.
Well, maybe if I would ask you, what do you think was the core of his interest in Luther? So what would you say? So, Luther is itself a complex position, and he obviously has a Hegelian background to be interested in it. But what would you say? What was the core of Bob's interest in Luther?
I think, well, in some respects, actually, you might say it's not really a Lutheran idea that I think is at the heart of Bob's interest, and he acknowledges this, actually, and that is the primacy of reason. It seems to me that for Bob, to be free is ultimately to be rational and to be guided by the demands of reason. But then there are various other things that belong with that. Letting yourself be guided by reason, being guided by reason in such a way that you no longer feel the constraint of that reason, being filled with reason, and that issuing in both love and mutual recognition. There are a lot of these things that I think he found echoes of in Luther, even though, of course, Luther has a very different view of reason. But I suppose Hegel has a very and Bob and I would have a very easy response to that. Is that what Luther was really targeting was the whore, as it were, of understanding, not of reason. In some sense, Luther didn't really have a conception of reason in the sense in which I think Hegel was using it and the Bob was using it. So that seems to me what's crucial, and it touches on this problem of freedom we were talking about before. What is freedom? Is freedom ultimately the capacity of at least at its base or at beginning, Willkür, or is it to act in accordance with the demands of reason? And I think Bob was really committed to the latter. So I suppose you could say he was a rationalist in many ways, but he thought that there were a lot of aspects of the appropriate ethical comportment towards reason that you could find in a religious language in Luther. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, it's not for me to speak. I mean, that's what I got out of conversations with Bob. I don't think, I shouldn't speak out of turn, but I don't think Bob was particularly religious as a person. I'm pretty sure that he wasn't. So I don't think it's that side of things. I think he's seeing in Luther the religious expression of a certain conception of reason and how. And if you almost replace the grace of God with reason, then you've got a pretty good conception of reason and freedom, I think. Anyway, that's what I don't know what your thoughts were, but that's how I would answer that.
Okay, so Joe, I think you want to mention something else or contribute?
Yeah, just to add. So yeah, I mean, God, so much to say. So one, totally right. I think theologians could benefit from this stuff. And I just met a theologian at a Cant conference in the US, who never met Bob, but like loved his work and used various of Bob's distinctions that he drew in the Moral Obligation book to help inform his current work on theology in different areas of it. And it was fascinating talking to him, because he was like, it's great to have a philosopher who really seriously engages with this stuff and understands it, but also helps make sense of it, even to, us theologians. So that was just something nice I thought I'd share. But yeah, just to add to Stephen's answer to your question, Ulrich, so like, what did Bob take from Luther? So for what it's worth, I don't massively like Luther either, and I don't see why we have to go to Luther. And I take it that's because I disagree with Bob about some things. So I think Bob sometimes would describe himself as like an ontological optimist. So, he's a deeply optimistic person who basically thought reality was good. And, there'll be blips, but overall reality will tend in the right direction. So he was an ontological optimist, but he was an anthropological pessimist. So he thought us human beings were all basically hopeless, flawed, selfish creatures, right? And I think those bits of Luther really resonated with him in a way that, they don't with me. But those bits of Luther really resonated with him, right? The fact that we're all kind of fundamentally selfish. And I think he thought, there's a kind of a vanity related to that involved in thinking that we've got some significant choice to make about the good, right? So it's related to his anthropological pessimism. But part of it as well is, like you said, he just has this relentless energy for philosophy. And I remember him saying at one point, I remember him saying, I've been saying my whole life, Kant was a pietist and Hegel was a Lutheran. I've written them down, but I don't really know what they mean. And then he was like, I'm interested in this stuff. And the more he looked into it, I think he thought, look, Luther's ideas are fascinating. The philosophical traditions that we're interested in are so heavily influenced by them, and that influence doesn't really show up in how we properly understand them. So a proper understanding of these traditions and the ideas would involve a real understanding of Luther that he just thought we needed to do, and that he thought would be fruitful to get into. Especially, to be honest, I think in the end, the big philosophical significance of the whole thing was it would buttress his suspicion that choice was worthless, right? You really get into Luther, that gives him good grounds and ammo for arguing that choice and maybe even freedom itself are not really things that is worth having. So that was my sense. It's not really to disagree with Stephen, but just to add some other things that I got from conversations with him.
I think freedom is worth having for Bob. I think you'd have to acknowledge that he just doesn't think that freedom is found in so-called choice. I think it would be odd to argue that Bob didn't support freedom, and maybe that's for another occasion.
Okay, Josh, feel free to join the conversation.
Sure. I just wanted to add that one of the things that Bob had said to me is that he went from Leuven to Luther in a way on a quest to explain how life could be a gift if you kind of abstract away from God, because he thought that was possible with Leuven, but then he thought there was something about the structure of the argument in Leuven that invited having to pay attention to what Luther had said on the same question, and that's kind of what got him down the rabbit hole. And then he thought there was a remarkable structural similarity with a lot of other authors that he'd come across before that he thought was worth investigating. And so, to me, at least, just to push back maybe a tiny bit from the Joe intuition, is that the motivation was probably moral first and ontological second, rather than the other way around. But that was just one conversation we'd had along the way.
Okay, I think Lawrence also has a question or comment.
Thank you, Karen. I'm not sure. I wasn't sure how to put up my hand on the platform, so I sent you a hand. This is a question for Stephen, and I'm just wondering whether you would agree that Bob Stern's lack of interest in the transitions in Hegel is not just sort of an accidental feature of a difference that you have with him, but that to put it in Hegel's somewhat critical form, that in the interest of clarity and precision, Bob nests in the categories of the understanding and he demands to stay there. Do you think that's a fair statement to make about why, as an explanation of why he's not interested in Hegel's transitions?
No, I don't think that would be fair. I think because I think Bob was well, I don't really think. I mean, I know that he was well aware and very interested in the distinction between understanding and reason, and he had a properly Hegelian sense of what reason involves, just the unity of opposites and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that goes back a long way. I mean, obviously, I can't project back as to why Bob was not interested in the transitions. All I can say is that this goes, but this is one of the first things that we used to talk about as students. That might be to do with the different contexts in which Bob and I encountered Hegel. Bob was in a philosophy department, and we were both students at Cambridge. He was in the philosophy department. He was taught by Edward Craig, whose lectures I attended. And I remember Eddie Craig I went to his lectures on Hegel's logic, and he would start with, that Hegel thinks that being passes into nothing. And Craig would go, no, that can't be right. No, we've got to investigate this. And, that just wasn't the style that I had. The style that I had was I studied Hegel as a modern linguist. Is learning any philosopher is you've first got to become fluent in that philosopher. If it's Plato or Aristotle or Heidegger or Derrida or Hegel. So I wanted to know how everything worked from Hegel's point of view. I think Bob was much more prepared to look for the good arguments as he saw them in a philosopher. And I think he thought that the good arguments, many of them could stand alone. And so you didn't need to work your way through the whole of the logic to get to the account of the Begriff, or work all the way through the philosophy of right to get to the account of ethical life. And of course, there's some degree of truth to that. I mean, obviously, we'd never be able to do any Hegel if we had to start at the beginning all of the time. The other thing that's very different, and I think this is something that maybe has been alluded to, that Bob was an integral part of what I might call mainstream philosophical culture. He headed the REE panel or the REF panel. He was involved in the Aristotelian Society and so on, and he engaged with a lot of people in that area. And what he did so, if I can say this, without losing his soul. He did this by sticking to his principles. Ulrich, you mentioned Inwagen. Okay, he's doesn't enter into my world. I work on metaphysics, but for me, metaphysics is Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, Spinoza. That's what metaphysics is, and that's the debate I have. Bob is in a different area. So I think that was very important. I think for the kind of discussions that Bob was also used to having, it was very important to be able to bring arguments to bear. Whereas I was trained more in the process of, reading through the understanding the narrative structures of works of art, but also philosophical works. So we were quite different there. But I don't think it would be fair, to say that Bob was somehow stuck in the understanding. I think that would be an injustice that we just had different ideas about it. And but we remained friends and good colleagues over the years. It didn't really affect things, but it did mean perhaps that Bob would not have spent 800 pages working through the logic of being as I did for my pains, and most people wouldn't. But that matters to me. But I have to say, what was great about Bob is that he respected the fact that it mattered to me, and I was able to respect the fact that he saw things differently. So there was never any kind of dismissing. What are you doing that for? Absolutely the opposite. He gave real support. And particularly, actually, with the last book I did, he was a major support in helping me get that published. So sorry, it's a long answer. I didn't mean to ramble about that, but I hope that responds to your question.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, I think that maybe we take a short break here. There are some more questions, but we'll have a second Q&A period, and so I would like to stick more or less to the program and take a break here and then resume with the 3 talks and the second Q&A. So see you in 5 minutes. So let's resume, and I'm pleased to introduce our third speaker, Leonard Weiss. He completed his PhD at Sheffield University under the supervision of Bob in 2023, and the thesis is titled Hegel's Schelling and the Problem of Individuality. Leonard is currently a research associate at the Department of Philosophy of King's College, London, and he will talk about Bob Stern as a teacher.
Thank you very much. And I tried to give some impression of sort of how I got to know Bob and how I experienced him as a teacher and mentor. So to do that, I need to share my presentation. And is that working?
Yes.
Oop, working too well. All right, good. Let's get started. So during my MA, which I did at Munich, my friend and fellow Hegel enthusiast, Max Scholz, told me about a book which he presented to me as setting a standard for Hegel scholarship. That book was Bob's Hegel, Kant, and the Structure of the Object. Given Mac's impressive pitch about the book, I got myself a copy and started to learn from Bob. I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, the greatest challenge when writing about Hegel is to identify the main ideas within the overpowering mass of barely comprehensible material, sidetracks, and rabbit holes. In my estimation, one of Bob's greatest strengths as a writer are his bold decisions to focus on clearly defined key insights, which then enable him to guide the reader through the Hegelian jungle. While Bob's interests were certainly widespread, it is fair to say that in substance his work is a powerful defense of Hegel. One might be therefore tempted to think that someone supporting Hegel so strongly would be rather critical of attempts to expose problems with his thought. Bob surely was critical of such attempts, but I think he always saw them as welcome invitations to improve his own interpretation, never as hostile. Before coming to Sheffield, I had become interested in one of Hegel's main critics, namely Schelling, who attacked Hegel during his later period. Sure enough, Bob had already engaged with this critic. Indeed, he had done so regarding the very issue I came to find important, namely the question to what extent Hegel's metaphysics can vouch for the reality of individuals. By the time I had read Bob's paper, Individual Existence and the Philosophy of Difference, I was sure that he would make for a great PhD supervisor for my planned project on Hegel and Schelling. But would the man who had been introduced to me as setting standards in Hegel scholarship really welcome a defense of Schelling rather than Hegel? As I should learn, when I sent my draft proposal to Bob, he would. And indeed he did so with the same intellectual openness and enthusiasm with which he approached his own philosophical hero. That man was not looking for disciples, defending a school, or the philosophical orthodoxy of a small circle. He was looking for people to philosophize with. As a fresh PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield, I should learn that my case was by far not exceptional, but rather the rule. All of Bob's PhD students were working on decided Hegel critics. Barney Ricks and Michael Regier were doing work on Kierkegaard, and Roderick Howlett engaged with Adorno. Interestingly, the opposition of intellectual allegiances between Bob and his students went along with an equal amount of friendly connection, both with him and among us. Having had rather different experience in my previous education, I was astonished by this spirit of unity in difference. As I should later learn, this spirit extended not only to those who were working roughly within the same tradition, but manifested itself also in Bob's dialogue with philosophers from totally different backgrounds. The so-called analytic continental divide had a hard time when Bob was part of the discussion, and one of the most important lessons I learned from him is that different philosophical backgrounds need not undermine meaningful philosophical exchange. Keeping an open mind to other views or approaches on the one hand, and having a firm sense of one's own view and approach on the other hand, was no contradiction for him. That being said, Bob could give you a tough time. The fiercest debate I have witnessed in my career so far, Stephen knows what I'm talking about, what turned a conference dinner at Warwick into an intellectual battlefield. Bob and Stephen had a go at each other regarding the perennial issue, what else could it be, of the presuppositionlessness of Hegel's logic. Surprised and frankly somewhat intimidated to see the UK's most formidable Hegel scholars engaged in such a tussle, I tried to offer a way out in the conversation by making the remark that perhaps a somewhat lesser emphasis on presuppositionlessness might be justified by the fact that we couldn't be certain about the validity of all subsequent transitions in Hegel's project. Little did I know at that time that this very issue had already been the topic of heated discussions when Stephen and Bob were themselves PhD students. Needless to say, the matter further fueled the debate. But of course, that anecdote also brings to light another aspect of Bob's method, namely that he allowed himself the pleasure of a good fight with people to whom he was connected by especially strong bonds of friendship. Difference in unity, it seems, was an equally important aspect of the Bob Stern method. Descartes is known to be a cunning philosopher who often sent his philosophical messages in disguise. When advising his followers how to handle the watchful eye of the intellectual orthodoxy of the time, he would recommend to maintain the semblance of scholasticism while actually delivering the substance of the new philosophy. Lavatus prodeo was his motto. I proceed wearing a mask. Bob Stern also was a cunning philosopher, but his methods were infinitely more sophisticated. He knew that Hegel is sometimes a hard sell in the English-speaking world, and especially to students who had learned that absolute idealism is a sure path to intellectual disaster and must be fought with all possible means. That being said, Bob also knew that continental thinkers like de Beauvoir, Sartre, Fanon, Marx, Kierkegaard, or Adorno have a place in the hearts of undergraduate students. In his lectures, Bob would therefore point out that none of these popular thinkers could be fully understood without at least some knowledge of Hegel. In fact, he would add, Hegel should be seen as a spider in the center of a web in which all these philosophers were entangled. And at this point, I should add that this is a reconstruction, so I couldn't get hold of Bob's original lecture slide, but I'm pretty certain it roughly looked like that. And what Bob wanted to do with this slide when he presented it to people was to impress the idea upon them that some engagement with the spider was not such a bad idea after all, if one was to tackle the revolutionary and therefore irresistibly cool ideas contained in Fear and Trembling, Capital, or The Second Sex. But of course, the other aspect of the image is that spiders are no vegetarians, and that closer engagement with the Hegelian spider would not be possible without the risk of falling prey to its dialectical appetite. What may be a risk from the point of view of the anti-Hegelian was, of course, Bob's perpetual hope, namely that initial hostility to Hegel would ultimately, cunning of Stern, turn into a means for appreciating Hegel's thought. Before coming to an end, I should like to point out that Bob cared for people. On one level, his demeanor was indeed marked by the characteristic reservedness typical of the Englishman. However, in and through this appearance, there was deep concern for community. It was Bob who organized the annual open stage Philosophy Rocks at Sheffield, and it was Bob who invited the whole lot of his PhD students for tea at his home and to walks in Yorkshire's beautiful countryside. And it was also Bob who sought for a compromise between the legitimate interest of union strikes on the one hand and his duty to educate on the other hand, by organizing teach-outs when teaching at the university was impossible. Let's not forget how his chosen philosophy guided his actions. When the pandemic disrupted our philosophical community at Sheffield, we received an email from Bob reminding us not to despair, because the basic good order of things was unaffected by the recent events. By contrast, in Bob's words, and I quote, it was just existence which sucks a bit at the moment. Where the Doppelsatz actually works as a way of giving consolation, the grey and grey of philosophy really gives way to living spirit. Thanks, Bob. We'll do our best to keep it that way.
Thank you very much, Leonard. That was very beautiful. Okay, we turn to Alison. Alison Stone is a professor at Lancaster University, and she works on feminist philosophy, post-Kantian continental philosophy, the history of philosophy, and aesthetics. I'd like to mention two of her books. Her first book on Hegel's philosophy of nature, called Petrified Intelligence, Nature and Hegel's Philosophy, and a more recent monograph titled Being Born, Birth and Philosophy, published in 2019 with Oxford. Alison's talk will deal with Bob's philosophy, or aspects of Bob's philosophy, I think primarily, and her title is Bob Stern's Realist Interpretation of Hegel and His Arguments Regarding Moral Obligations. Please.
Thank you. Well, I knew Bob's work before I ever met Bob the person, but to begin by saying a little bit about my encounters with Bob the person. So I first met him when I had my first job as a temporary lecturer at Cambridge, and Bob was still connected there at the time as one of their external examiners. So that was how I first came to meet him. And I was amazed at how incredibly friendly he was, and so unassuming and helpful. But the unassuming to me, I would say, was one of his central qualities, and one of the things, I think it's fair to say that he's been one of my philosophical role models, and that's one of the things about him that I greatly admire, as well as the clarity and straightforwardness of his writing. And we quickly discovered these things that we had in common, such as jogging and having difficulty sleeping, and both coming from the wilds of Norfolk. So we stayed in touch, and he helped and advised me at various points, and we read various things of one another's. And we worked quite closely together when we both did the ref. Stephen alluded to this before, and then Bob went on to be the chair of the next ref panel. I realise that for those outside the UK, this may be a bit of a mystery, thankfully, probably. And I mean, I saw being the chair of the panel as the most horrendous job, but Bob, as usual, he seemed to be, just to take it in his stride and remain cheerful. Yeah. So to go back to his work, which I'd known before meeting him, when I was doing my PhD, which was in the 1990s, I was really taken with his book that people have talked about a little bit today already, Hegel, Kant, and the structure of the object. Although at the time I felt that nobody seems to have taken any notice of this book. But perhaps we always think that about the things that we're most partial to. But for me, it was important because Bob understood Hegel to have a realist metaphysics, but it wasn't about everything evolving out of God. But at the time, as I experienced the world of Hegel interpretation, there was this big divide between the so-called non-metaphysical interpretations and the metaphysical ones. And this, I would say, was a bit before Robert Pippin became such a huge name. So the non-metaphysical interpretations, as I encountered them, sort of Klaus Hartmann was the central figure, and he had this idea of Hegel as a category theorist. And Terry Pinkard as well, at the time, kind of presented himself as expanding on Klaus Hartmann. So that was one interpretive option. And then I also felt that the central kind of alternative metaphysical interpretation was that of Charles Taylor, who, he's sort of dropped off the radar in terms of Hegel scholarship now. But for him, for Taylor, the fundamental tenet of Hegel's philosophy was that the universe is the embodiment of God, as he says. He says it's an expression of God. It's something posited by God in order to manifest what he is. There's a thoroughly religious interpretation. Now, of course, that might not be a problem, but for me, at least, I was quite taken with Bob's competing metaphysical view that kind of lost a lot of this sort of religious element. And people have alluded to this already today. Bob argued that for Kant, the transcendental subject imposes unity upon objects, whereas for Hegel, objects are intrinsically unified by virtue of belonging to substantial kinds. So they don't need to have any unity imposed upon them by us. And so for Bob, the concept, Hegel's term, the concept, refers to these substantial kinds rather than to imposed categories. Now, I largely agreed with this view. And I struggled to articulate what it was about it that I wasn't quite convinced by. And actually, I think it's come up a bit today. So I was really interested in trying to make some sense of Hegel's philosophy of nature. And this part at the end of Hegel's logic, where he appears to be deriving material reality from the concept. At least on the face of it, it looks like that's what's happening. And so it seemed to me on that basis that for Hegel, the concept and the idea that they had some kind of existence prior to material reality. Now, obviously, a lot depends on prior, whatever that means. But it seems to me that Bob thought of the concept in terms of these substance kinds that are the sort of immanent structure of material reality. But I couldn't see any sign that he thought that for Hegel, the concept had a kind of primacy or priority to the material world. I think this maybe connects with what Stephen was saying about the issue of transitions. So it was sort of something like that where I think I had a bit of a disagreement. But that is rather a long time ago and feels like a totally different world, really. So to move on to some of Bob's more recent work on moral obligation. So this took on a new importance for me, actually, when I began working on Frances Power Cobbe, who's a 19th century moral and religious philosopher, and she's little known today. But at the time, she was really big. She was kind of, she had a major falling out with Darwin. It was public news, so she was sort of up there with people of that stature. And I had to find a way to shoehorn her into this event somehow. No, I don't think it really is shoehorning her, because when I got into Cobbe, I discussed my work on Cobbe with Bob. He had some characteristically helpful questions and responses, and actually he passed on a really great question about Cobbe from Crosby, which she asked, well, how could Cobbe have been, as she was, a devout Christian and a lesbian, and the sort of lesbian separatist almost, as she was, and quite publicly so. I just thought that was sort of such a great question. And yeah, the answer would be complicated. But anyway, to go back to Bob, so you probably know that in his work on moral obligation, he draws this kind of triangle amongst Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard. And to simplify and possibly not be entirely accurate, he thinks that Kant accounts for what makes morality obligatory or binding by saying that this binding quality that morality has for us stems from our divided nature. So we're divided between desires and reason, so that what constrains our desires then takes the form of a sort of an imperative and a must. So this goes back to Bob's earlier book, where he thought of Kant as saying that the subject imposes unity on objects. And here again, there's this emphasis on imposition. There's this gap between desires and reason that has to be bridged. And so sort of reason has to be imposed in order to make the bridge. And as Bob says, then there's the question, how is this compatible with our being autonomous? And his answer is that it's compatible because the obligatory quality of morality comes from our being divided. So it still comes from us, from our nature. And it's not the case that morality obligates because God's imposed it on us, in Bob's interpretation of Kant. And so then Bob continues to the rest of this triangle, kind of saying that this means that Hegel thinks Kant's problem is this split between reason and desire that he solves with ethical life. And then Kierkegaard thinks that makes morality insufficiently demanding. It's sort of too easy just by taking part in social life to become good. So he goes back to a version of a divine command theory, which then makes ethics heteronymous. And so we've kind of gone round in a loop. And I think there's a tremendous amount in this. But I found it very helpful in trying to get to grips with Cobb's ethics, because Cobb professed both to be a Kantian and to be combining the best of all moral theories, and that for her included a theistic account of ethics. So she argued that moral obligations require there to be a law, and a law requires a lawgiver, and the lawgiver must be God. Otherwise, we wouldn't really be bound. We wouldn't, we could just kind of throw the laws sort of on or off as we wanted. So if we put that in terms of Bob's triangle, Cobb would be the closest to Kierkegaard, right down to the fact that she says she's a Kantian, but to a modern reader, it looks as if she's got a heteronymous ethics. But one of the things that I've found Bob's work really helpful with is saying that Cobb is another person who engaged with what he calls the problem of moral obligation. And his work also makes sense of a feature of her thought that could otherwise be puzzling, because as well as saying that God legislates morality, she also aligned herself up with realism, sort of British intuitionist moral realism, saying that distinctions of right and wrong exist eternally, and they're not artifacts of divine choice. And this fits in with what Bob says about modern divine command theories, that they bring God in to explain what makes morality obligatory rather than to decide its content. So the content is taken to be real and independently existing. And that's absolutely true of Cobb. And the fact that his work so usefully illuminates the thought of someone whom he didn't discuss suggests to me that he was quite right to think that this problem of moral obligation is kind of a real problem, sort of an independent really existing problem in its own right. We can look back at various sort of different moral thinkers to see how they addressed it in light of Bob's work. So I think my time is up, so I will stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alison. So we now have our final speaker, Josh Forstenzer. He's a senior lecturer in philosophy at Sheffield University and so a close colleague of Bob. Josh's research focuses on American pragmatism and philosophy of education. And I'd like to mention one of his publications, a monograph titled Deweyan Experimentalism and the Problem of Method in Political Philosophy, which was published with Routledge in 2019. And you see already the title of his contribution, Remembering Bob Stern as a Colleague and as a Friend.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you so much to all the speakers who've come before and to the questions. It's just such a joy to be able to share in the memory of Bob and to think about the things that animated him and to remember his qualities. I'm going to give a perhaps less philosophical talk than most of the others and a more personal one because fundamentally, I think Bob's significance in my life is as the whole human being that he was. Even though we read a lot of things together, both me of his and mostly him of my work, and we disagreed a whole lot and had a great time doing so. But I'm just going to start with a brief introduction of how I think about Bob. And in a sense, I think of him as three different Bobs. So Joe, who was at the memorial that we had in the philosophy department, you've heard a bit of this before. I apologize for you, but I'm sharing a little bit with others because I came to know Bob when I was but a student, an undergraduate student. And Bob was then the head of department. Now, believe it or not, he didn't quite look the way he does in the picture on the left, but not far off. He looked very, very young when he was head of department in the department at Sheffield. And I was on the student staff committee. And Bob came across as the kindest, most generous academic. In fact, he represented to me kind of what I had thought I would find when I came to university. He was just so gentle and supportive and interested. And anytime students had ideas about ways in which we could change things, he always just said yes. And he pretty much started from, there's a way to do this, just leave it with me. So if we wanted more feedback, he'd say, no problem, I'll get the staff to do it. If we said we wanted more clarity on assessments, he said, absolutely, we should do the work. And if we asked for more computers, he'd say, well, let me work on it. It was back in the day when computers were scarce in universities and it might take a bit more work from the administration. But Bob was just so generous with his time and so willing to support students in their journeys that honestly, it made me kind of think that this is what all academics are going to be like. And I bit by bit discovered that wasn't always true. But what was perhaps the moment of inflection in my relationship with Bob is that a friend of mine who was also an undergrad wanted to launch a project where undergraduate students would go into schools in Sheffield and do philosophy with school children, because in the UK, there wasn't at the time any philosophy in schools. Now there's some, but still not very much. And Bob was just incredibly supportive of this venture. And so those of us who had this dedication met with Bob a number of times, and Bob put us in touch with David Bell's wife, who had been a teacher in the city. And through these meetings, we were able to launch us off and go into one of the schools. In fact, it was one of the roughest schools in Sheffield at the time, and did some philosophy with 14, 15-year-olds who weren't very likely to continue to study past age 16, which was compulsory age then. And Bob gave us just the best advice, the best guidance, and really saw us through what could have been, in fact, a very bad situation, given that it might have not gone so well. But Bob just was always there to make sure that if we had any problems or any questions or we were ever in doubt, we would be in good hands. And he did this without ever overstepping. You might think of the temptation of the teacher to just say, let me do this, I'll just go in instead of you and I'll be fine. But Bob never did that. He always had faith in us and made sure that we would be able to deliver these classes with confidence. Now, I got to know Bob much, much better during my master's because Bob was the the head of our Masters in Political Theory research group at that time. And we were reading a bunch of papers, some of which were on Hegel, some of which were on Marx. And Bob was always the most argumentative person in the room. So all of a sudden I discovered a completely different character than I had known before. He was just this ravaging, devastating arguer with every student in the room, every colleague who'd walk by. Bob was absolutely relentless, but deeply engaging and inspiring, so much so that I took it upon myself to read something that Bob had written. I was very much into Richard Rorty then, and Bob had written a paper where he disparaged Rorty as being kind of this Nietzschean nihilist of a kind, or overly relativistic. And instead we should opt for Alistair MacIntyre. This was in an edited volume for the 1990s that was edited by Sue Mendes. And I wrote a paper telling Bob he was wrong, basically. As you can imagine, we argued about this for many, many, many hours. And by the end of it, I got a good grade and I was really happy. I was very pleased with myself. It took several years later, post-PhD, for me to realize that Bob had been right all along and that actually I had to revise my views, which I did. But nevertheless, I was proud of myself for having been able to argue something that Bob could at least recognize as worthwhile, even though he fundamentally disagreed with it. During my PhD, I worked with Bob, and he was just a fundamental advisor. He would take so much time to read all of the drafts. He would always have the most profound things to say about the work, and he's just very supportive. Bob was capable of answering emails at midnight. If there was a crisis, he was capable of showing up on the day if there was something that was desperately needed. And he just was so generous with his life because he was often running postgraduate parties. So we used to have these summer socials in the philosophy department that would take place in Bob and Crosby's house. And Bob would very generously make everything within that house available to us to spend a really good quality time and enjoy time with each other, doing philosophy, often in the garden, and just having that kind of experience of philosophy as a way of life, as something that's connected not just to the institution, but also to the human aspect of life. Now, I did notice the day that I passed my Viva that Bob went from that very genteel Englishman that Leonard was talking about, always very polite, never a word too far. Bob turned into the Bob that I have known for the last decade or so, which is, an honest, authentic human being who tells you when he thinks someone is really up to no good and probably should have said something better, which was quite a joy for me. The day of my Viva, I discovered the fullness of Bob's character, and it was just really entertaining for me. One of the reasons it was so entertaining was because it turned out that Bob and I have in common a secular Jewish sense of humor. We both are secular Jews, and in fact, probably a Talmudic sensitivity towards philosophy itself. You should take it seriously enough to have an argument about it, but probably not too much, such as to change your relationships to important others on the basis of it. One thing that I discovered that was very fun was that I worked for a little while in the Students' Union, and I worked with the upper echelons of the university at Sheffield. And there was, in fact, a test that was named after Bob, because when Bob had been head of department in philosophy, the administration feared so much his questions and his lines of questioning that they called it the Bob Stern stress test. So any idea that they'd come up with had to first pass the muster that Bob would be satisfied with the proposal. Otherwise, they just would think they had more work to do before they could present it to the academic population at large. Bit by bit, we became full-fledged colleagues. And in that time, I witnessed just how much Bob was an engine for my department. He built community in every way he could, from reading groups to reaching out to students in difficulty, to Philosophy Rocks and other activities, which I'll mention a little bit more in a second. And we worked together very closely on undergraduate admissions. And this was not a fun task, as you might imagine. It's one of the least enjoyable tasks in my institution. And Bob nevertheless found a way to always make it deeply collegial, deeply honest, which is not what the university necessarily wanted from us, and a fun experience for me. He really looked after me and made sure that I was at my best, that I was in a situation to succeed, and that if ever there was a problem that I encountered, he would be there to help me. This, I should say, was in a context where Bob still had tremendously high standards. Bob was someone who was very exacting, and he would, something less than good was simply not up to scratch. Now, one of the things that Bob got involved in over the years that really did generate community was the philosophy reading weekend. So for those of you who don't know, at Sheffield every year we have a get together out in the Peak District with undergraduates, postgraduates, and members of the department. And we just do philosophy together and then go for a long walk and have drinks at the pub and still do philosophy and go back to the youth hostel and do philosophy charades and basically just do a whole bunch of things that philosophers geek out doing. And Bob was just a recurrent figure in these experiences. He was a driving engine. So you might see on the picture on the left, there's just a sliver of Bob there next to Chris Bennett, who was another one of Bob's PhD students. We, as a department, have benefited so much from Bob's presence and his energy in keeping things going throughout the years. Now, Philosophy Rocks was already mentioned by Leonard, but that's also something that was very Bob-like. So Bob loved Bob Dylan. For those who don't know, he was just an absolute enthusiast. In fact, the only time I've heard him genuinely fall out with anyone, I've heard from Angie Hobbs, who's a colleague of mine and a friend of Bob's from when they were students at Cambridge, when Angie failed to mention one of Bob Dylan's discs on Desert Island. So Desert Island is this radio show on BBC Radio 4 in the UK where you got to say what would be the songs or the discs that you keep if these were the only bits of music you could listen to for the rest of your life. And she had told Bob that she was going to mention Bob Dylan. But then when the moment came, she changed her mind. And Bob apparently never forgave her for this. So they remained good friends, but nevertheless, I think Bob actually was deeply hurt by that. So there you go. It might not be philosophy that can get Bob going, but it certainly was Bob Dylan that could get under his skin. And Bob just was so able to bring people together to really release us, I think, from some of the seriousness of academic life and build a path into the more human, emotional dimensions that music can create. Now, as an individual, I have been friends with Bob for over a decade, and I felt deeply seen, supported, and appreciated. But one of the ways in which I've got to say that Bob has impacted on my life most fundamentally is by opening his life to mine. So in some of these pictures, there's Bob and I, but in some of these pictures also Bob's family and my wife. And Bob just was so gracious and so willing to extend himself, just as Crosby is and was. And in so doing, they've just opened a whole world in the philosophy department where that crossover between philosophy and being just authentic human beings who share in each other's company, who have a good time, who are able to have a laugh, just has been such a fundamentally valuable part of my life. And I have to say that Bob, if nothing else, is, in my book, the quintessential mensch, which if you speak a bit of Yiddish, that means a very good person. And Bob really had such tremendous integrity, such capacity to care, even in difficult circumstances. And I have to say that I think he left a permanent mark on my life. When my own father passed away, my wife was doing fieldwork in Greece. Bob and Crosby took me in. They regularly fed me and took me to do cultural activities and made sure that I was okay when I was grieving very deeply. And they did this, without me asking, without me even signaling anything. They just kind of figured out that I was in need. And Bob did this, in fact, these kinds of small things for many people in the department. He always reached out to new members of the department and made sure they knew that they were in a community of people. So I'm just going to end on one final point, which is that in my book, Bob can be understood as a human being as well as a philosopher that has a congruent conception of the good. And I think it comes as this kind of golden triangle of the good life. So I think that for Bob, fundamentally, if we attended to community with effort and with love, then what we would achieve is a kind of collective self-knowledge, which itself requires and expresses transmission of all the good that's being generated over and over again. And Bob and I think, shared a fundamental belief in the iterative aspect of these kinds of efforts, that it's not so much the fact that we must achieve the good in any one go, but we should just try to achieve it over and over again. And we have that kind of hopeful, open faith that ultimately it will be for the better, even though we might not be able to track exactly how. Bob exemplified this in every interaction I've ever had with him and every interaction I've seen him have with anyone in my life. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, I will add, for those who are interested, I did source some quotes from the memorial page, because I did want to say, in case you think it's just me saying these things, it's not. Here's a bunch of beautiful things that other people have said. including making the ref fun, which is genuinely a challenge because the ref is authentically not fun, and just the wonderful ways in which Bob has changed other people's lives. There was one comment that really left me moved from someone anonymous, I don't know, but it was the tenacity, determination, optimism, and good humor on park runs and in life. That does sound to me like Bob. So I thought I should share that with all of you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe, for your contribution and for sharing these other words from his friends and colleagues. So this means that the floor is open for further questions and other contributions or reminiscences. Anton?
Yes, I have a question for Alison concerning this one of the first disagreement between you and Robert, which you mentioned. So concerning the real kinds, as I understood. So your position, I think I remember from the petrified intelligence, that's about the priority of the sort of natural in Hegel's system, right? So I didn't quite understand what exactly you take the disagreement though to be, right, between you and Robert. This conceptual realist.
Hadn't realized I was muted. I'd be guided by what others think about this as well, but I think that in his first book, Bob it's a very Aristotelian view of Hegel, where I think that that the concept kind of structures, it organizes material reality, but it doesn't exist prior to it in any sense. So although there is, although obviously Hegel did produce the Science of Logic and the Encyclopedia Logic, that this would be sort of looking at the concept in abstraction. But the way that it really exists is always kind of to be structuring the material world. Whereas what I was, really sort of wrestling with at that point was the transition from logic to nature. And on the face of it, it does look as if Hegel thinks that that the concept has some kind of priority and kind of inverts itself to sort of give rise to material reality. I was never very happy with sort of him having that view. And so, I tried sort of in Petrified Intelligence, I guess, to kind of sort of deflate it further and go sort of even further away from the sort of middle position in a way that Bob has in his first book. But I don't know what you think. I still think that in a way the most natural reading is just that Hegel does think the concept has some kind of priority and gives rise to matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the logic we have a more general argument that there are natural kinds and that it solves certain philosophical problems that without that we wouldn't be able to solve. But then he goes on to talk about natural kinds, right, in the philosophy of nature. That's sort of in a very broad strokes. But as far as the transition between logic and the philosophy of nature, that's the difficult part. I'm not sure I can say something very intelligible right now.
Well, maybe in view of the time, we might also want to maybe hear from some other perspective. And Jin Hua, I think you had your hand up before the break. Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you. My question is that because the professor just mentioned Bob's last paper, Schelling's freedom. And I also heard that because Bob doesn't think that Willkür is as freedom at all, Willkür is not freedom at all, rather than the desire. So it seems like, I mean, in Bob's last paper, Schelling's freedom, he thinks that freedom is not the choice. So because most of the people think that we have the choice, seems like the choice is a condition of the freedom. So my question is that I don't know, because this paper is his last paper, so I don't know whether Bob changes the ideas of freedom or not, because it seems like in this paper he mentions that for Schelling, freedom is as a nature of human being. Although Schelling can't explain how does the evil come from.
That she was diagnosed with epilepsy. The families want to see evidence that the police.
Oh, sorry, I think someone just answered my question. Okay, just quickly explaining my question. So in Bob's last paper, he thinks that Schelling thinks that freedom is, as a nature of human being. So for Schelling, there is no problem to explain how the evil comes from. Although there's no answer to answer the question, but in my opinion, it seems like in this paper, Bob didn't mention that the relationship between the human freedom and the freedom of God. It didn't mention this perspective. So I want to ask these two professors how they understand this point.
Ulrich, would you like to respond?
Well, I mean, I somehow disagree with his interpretation of Schelling. I mean, there's this idea in Schelling that in a certain way, for a good man, there is no choice. But that is more on a kind of a psychological level, you know. If you're a good character, kind of, you go straight forward for the good. You're not a good character if you always falter and think this and that, and then finally you pull yourself together. But being firm for the good, that's what makes up a good character. In that sense, that doesn't mean that there's no alternative. It means that the alternative is such that you're not really interested in that situation. However, there is some kind of a second layer, which is a kind of a metaphysical story. And the metaphysical story is kind of influenced by Kant's book on the possibility of evil, and somehow by the idea, and that's where I kind of project, so to speak, the theory of where it comes all from God back on a theory of action. That within the rational orientation, so to speak, inside of it, there's a possibility for a deviation of it. So it doesn't come from the outside. You have to explain why, if you follow the good, so to speak, or why, if you're basically a reasonable being, there is something which makes you deviate as a reasonable being, and it doesn't come from outside. So in that sense, there's no choice in sense of an arbitrary choice, but there's a possibility of a deviation which comes from within reason itself. And that's a more fundamental level than the level where you say there's no choice, there's just one straight path, and that's a path to reason. That's more like a Hegelian position if you take it as a metaphysical position. But for Schelling, it isn't really a metaphysical position, it's a position of moral psychology. And in the moral psychology, it's certainly right that the good person doesn't really have a choice because she's firmly good. She goes for the right way. And in that sense, I think we should disentangle these different layers. And then Schelling looks less Hegelian Lutheran than it might look at the first instance.
Sorry, just let me sure. So you think that Schelling's definition about the freedom is kind of a psychological perspective, not rather than not metaphysical?
No, I think that's not the idea of freedom as having no alternative. Of course, the idea of freedom itself is a metaphysical issue, but this issue depends on the real notion of freedom. as distinct from a merely idealist notion of the freedom, is the freedom which allows for the evil. And that's a metaphysical notion, but it's not the same as a person who just go for what's rational.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Sorry to interrupt, Jinho. I think that maybe we need also to take a look at the time, and I think that Alison also would like to respond to this.
Yes, I can do so very quickly. It's just Ulrich, I have struggled with thinking about, with Bob's recent work on Schelling, what is it about it that I disagree with? And so what you say there really resonates with me, except where you did then clarify and answer that, of course, freedom is a metaphysical matter. Because it seems to me, wouldn't the metaphysical dimension of it be that whole stuff about the grunt and the abgrunt, and so, contained within sort of reason on the level of the kind of universe, there's also this prior kind of non-rational element, and that would be the sort of metaphysics that accounts for that kind of ambivalence within reason that you talk about.
Well, I mean, if you look how Schelling really does it, he says, well, let us look at the universe from a human point of view. So he infuses, so to speak, the human point of view to explain what's going on in the universe. And basically that presupposes that's already present in the human as well. So the ground thing and the pushing or so. So whenever you move ahead, so to speak, there are two different sides where the ground kind of pushes back. That's part of also of the psychology. And that's where I differ from Bob, because I think Bob thinks that's part of the cosmological story, and the human freedom comes only after. And then human freedom looks like Hegel's freedom. And so that's that's basically the idea I disagree about. So freedom is not just like we stand on these two different sides and then we have some kind of a rational or spontaneous push to do one or the other. But if you're really on that level, it becomes unintelligible, and we wouldn't get ahead of Kant's book on religion. So I think that's just a tactics of reading where Bob and I were on different sides. I actually was surprised that he did work on these issues. So that came from me out of the blue. I mean, on the Schelling way.
Oh, it's something, yeah, I talked about it with the Hegel conference, and then Bob and I continued a bit of a conversation about it sort of over the years, and he sent me that most recent paper. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So you helped to bring it about.
I wouldn't say that. No.
Okay, Stephen, maybe a concluding comments or contribution.
Yes, I had just one. Okay, because I had a question for some of Bob's students, but just a concluding comment. Well, before I say anything in response to the question we just had, I just want to thank very much sort of everybody. It's been actually quite moving listening to what everyone's had to say. So I really appreciate what everyone's said today, and I just think, I mean, just imagining if Bob had been part of this discussion, I mean, I don't know that we would really have got many questions in. He would have been so enthusiastic about the care and attention that people have paid to his work and everything he's done for us. On the particular question that came up, I suppose just one very brief remark, really, and that is my understanding is that really what Bob wants to distinguish is between Villa and Willkür. And he wants Villa to be, freedom is the rational will. But the idea of a kind of Willkür, that is a sort of freedom prior to Villa, is what he really wants to get away from. Now, of course, you can will the bad or you can will the good. There are those alternatives. But it's not like there's a choice there that we confront prior to willing the bad or willing the good. We do one or we do the other. We're free in one case, we're sort of not free in the other. And I think that was very much part of what I see as a sort of rationalism in Bob, and just thinking about the Schelling connection, it was really striking what Ulrich says about Schelling, this dark side to reason. I mean, others might have to contribute, but I'm not sure that Bob thought there was a dark side to reason. I think he thinks we can withdraw our assent to reason, but then we end up willing the bad. So there's a dark side to us, but I don't know there's a dark side to reason. And that, I mean, there's another figure we haven't talked about, and I'm not sure if this is relevant here at all, but who's very important to Bob's work, and that's Aristotle. I mean, right from that first book. And if we had time, it would be lovely to see whether there are Aristotelian strands that underlying some of Bob's thoughts in these areas. And I don't know. It's just a question. But anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. And I think that we should conclude here. I think it was a very rich meeting, and I'm very happy that all of you were here. And I would like to thank the 5 speakers in particular, but also all participants. And I also saw very moving notes in the chat, and I'm really happy that we were able to share our memories and thoughts and our love for Bob. So thank you very much. I also wanted to mention that we have another session of the Leuven seminar next week, and I put the program or the link to the program in the chat. So next week's session is on Kant's moral philosophy and Schmidt, and evidently we would be happy to see some of you next week or in one of the future sessions of the Leuven seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you.